When the city was at risk of burning, this police canine dog risked everything to save it. A series of deadly arson attacks shakes the city, leaving behind nothing but destruction and terror. Derek, a seasoned firefighter, teams up with his loyal canine, Roxy, to uncover the identity of a vengeful arsonist. As the fire's target grows more personal, Roxy's sharp instincts uncover shocking truths within the fire department itself. With every clue pointing closer to a devastating confrontation, Roxy faces a deadly choice: stop the arsonist or save the people trapped in the flames. Time is running out, and the stakes have never been higher. The shrill sound of the phone rang through Derek's small apartment, its urgency cutting through the quiet. He reached for the receiver, barely awake but immediately alert when he recognized the voice on the other end. It was Captain Hayes, his boss at the fire department. "Derek, we've got another one. Same as the others. You and Roxy need to get over there now," Hayes said, his tone sharp and direct. "It's spreading fast. Be ready for anything." Derek rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the last traces of sleep. He didn't need to ask questions. The pattern had already been set. An unrelenting series of fires had been striking the city for weeks now. Each blaze was well planned, leaving nothing but charred buildings and confusion in its wake. No one had been able to figure out the motive, but it was clear someone was targeting the city's most critical projects. He glanced at Roxy, his loyal canine partner, sleeping on her bed in the corner. She was already awake, sensing the change in the air. Her eyes locked with his, and with a quick movement, she bounded over to his side. Derek grabbed his gear, and without a word, the two of them were out the door. The scene of the fire was chaotic, flames licking the night sky, casting an orange glow over the area. Firefighters were everywhere, dousing the burning building with water, but the damage was already done. Derek scanned the scene, his mind working in overdrive, looking for anything unusual. "Over here," a voice called out from the wreckage. It was Lieutenant Morrison, one of Derek's trusted colleagues. He was standing near the base of the building, pointing at something on the ground. Derek approached, his boots crunching against the scorched earth. Morrison knelt down, and Derek followed his gaze. The ground was littered with soot and ash, but there was something strange about one section of it, a footprint. It was large, clear in the way it was pressed into the blackened surface, but it wasn't like any normal shoe print. This one was distinct, almost like the tread of a specialized boot, not the kind of footwear you'd expect at a typical fire scene. Derek leaned in closer, examining it carefully. "Looks like someone was trying to cover their tracks," he muttered, brushing a bit of ash away. "But they missed this." Roxy sniffed the ground, her keen nose twitching as she scanned the footprint. Her tail held still, and she let out a soft growl, a warning sound. "Roxy's on something," Derek said, his voice quiet but urgent. He looked up at Morrison. "I'm going to need a sample of this ash for analysis." "Something's off." Morrison nodded and quickly got on the radio, calling for a forensic team. Meanwhile, Derek crouched next to Roxy, who was now sniffing the air with determination. He could tell she had picked up on something important. "Roxy, find it," Derek ordered. The dog's ears pricked up as she began to lead him further into the wreckage, weaving between burned-out walls and collapsed beams. Derek followed closely behind, his mind racing. He'd seen countless fires before, but this one felt different. The precision of the burn, the timing, the lack of anything left to chance, it was too methodical. This wasn't just arson for the sake of destruction. Whoever was behind this was making a point. Roxy stopped near the corner of the building where a pile of broken bricks had fallen. She sniffed the air again and began pawing at the ground. Derek crouched beside her, scanning the area. Beneath the rubble, he spotted a glint of something shiny. His fingers brushed the dirt aside, revealing a small glass vial. It wasn't big, maybe the size of a pen, but it was unmistakable. "Accelerant," Derek muttered under his breath, recognizing the faint chemical smell that clung to the vial. This wasn't a simple fire, it was planned, intentional, and someone had made sure it would burn hot and fast. Derek pocketed the vial, his mind already piecing together the clues. Fires that started in one part of the city, then another. A specific type of footwear, carefully chosen. And now, accelerant. Whoever was behind this was careful. Precise. They knew exactly what they were doing. "You think this is connected to the other fires?" Morrison asked, walking up behind him. Derek didn't answer right away. He stood, his gaze scanning the smoldering remains of the building. His instincts told him this wasn't random. This was something bigger. "I don't know yet," Derek finally said, his voice steady. "But I've got a feeling it's more than just a string of fires. Someone's targeting something." "Any idea what?" Derek shook his head. "Not yet. But we're going to find out." He turned to Roxy, who was still standing alert, her nose raised as she sniffed the air. She was as sharp as ever, and Derek knew she was just getting started. "Let's find some answers." As the fire crews began to pull back and the area started to clear, Derek and Roxy stayed behind, continuing their investigation. The fire had left only ruins, but Derek's focus never wavered. He wasn't going to stop until he understood who was behind these attacks and why. The following day, Derek found himself in a meeting at the city's central fire station. The room was filled with key people, the fire chief, investigators, and other members of the task force. "You're saying these fires are linked?" Chief Owens asked, leaning forward in his chair. Derek nodded. "It's not just random. Whoever's starting these fires is targeting something, and it's not just for the thrill. The pattern is too precise." He laid out the details, how each fire seemed to follow a specific sequence, each location tied to a major city project, a new sports complex, a planned expansion of the downtown area, a tech hub under construction. These aren't random targets. Whoever's behind this is sending a message, and it's aimed at something bigger than just property damage. The room grew quiet as the others exchanged glances. Derek could feel the weight of their concern. This wasn't just arson, it was personal, and whoever was starting the fires was clearly trying to sabotage something important. "So what's the next step?" Investigator Daniels asked, speaking up for the first time. "We've got the accelerant and footprint. That's something, but we still don't have a name, a face." Derek stood, walking to the whiteboard where the locations of the fires were marked. "We need to figure out what these projects have in common. Why would someone go after them?" As he studied the map, Roxy stood by his side, her nose still alert, as if she knew more than they did. "We'll track down leads from here," Derek said, "and I think we'll find our answer." But deep down, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a string of fires. It was a carefully orchestrated attack, and whoever was behind it was prepared to go to any lengths to make their point. Derek and Roxy were just getting started, and the path ahead would be full of surprises. As the meeting broke up, Derek stood by the map, eyes scanning the locations of the fires again. He knew the pattern wasn't random. Each site had something in common. Each fire was aimed at a building tied to a major development project in the city. But what did that mean? Why these specific buildings? Roxy nudged his leg, her soft bark pulling him from his thoughts. The dog was already ready to go. Derek gave her a quick pat on the head before grabbing his jacket and heading for the door. "Let's get to work, girl." They climbed into the truck, and Roxy's tail wagged as the engine roared to life. Derek drove through the night streets, his mind already mapping out their next move. He had a hunch, and he couldn't shake it. There had to be something more to this, something they hadn't found yet. The scent of accelerants led them to an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. The building was dark and abandoned, a relic of the city's past, hidden behind a maze of alleys and overgrown weeds. Derek parked the truck a few hundred yards away, and Roxy hopped out, her ears perked up. "This is it, Roxy. Let's see what we can find." Derek led the way, his flashlight cutting through the thick darkness of the warehouse. He could feel the tension in the air. The faint smell of gasoline still lingered. As he stepped closer, Roxy began to bark, her nose working overtime as she sniffed the ground. The warehouse was eerily silent, with no sign of life. Derek's flashlight flickered over piles of old crates and rusted machinery, casting long shadows on the walls. It didn't feel right. Every part of his gut told him that something was waiting in the shadows. Suddenly, they heard a sound, a soft scraping noise coming from the far corner of the warehouse. Derek motioned for Roxy to stay close, his hand tightening around the flashlight as he cautiously approached the noise. As they got closer, a figure emerged from the darkness, a man, tall and gaunt, standing by a stack of crates. His eyes were wide, and his face was pale, almost too pale. "I know what you're looking for," the man said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "And I can help you. But you have to listen." Derek took a step forward, his instincts kicking in. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he moved quickly, his eyes darting nervously. "I've been following it too, the fire, the pattern. I know what's happening here. But you don't understand. You're too close. It's all connected." Before Derek could ask anything more, the man suddenly collapsed to the floor, blood spreading across the concrete in a pool. Derek rushed to him, but it was too late. The man was already dead. Roxy growled low in her throat, her body tense as she watched the scene unfold. Derek's mind raced as he stood over the body, trying to piece together what had just happened. It was clear that the man had known something big. But now, he was gone, and the only clue he left behind was his cryptic warning. "Stay with me, girl," Derek muttered, turning back toward the crates. He scanned the area for any other signs of life, but the warehouse remained silent. After a few minutes, Derek stood and grabbed his phone. He sent the location to the authorities and called for backup. The body would need to be investigated, but Derek couldn't shake the feeling that the man's death was no accident. The arsonist was closer than they thought, and they needed answers, fast. Back at the station, Derek sat with his thoughts as Roxy lay at his feet, her head resting on the floor. He couldn't get the man's warning out of his mind. There was something important about what he had said, something Derek hadn't fully understood. He ran through the details in his head, his words, his fear, and the blood on the floor. It all pointed to one thing. The arsonist was hiding in plain sight. Then it hit him. What if someone inside the fire department was involved? The thought made his stomach tighten. The fires had been too precise, the information about the buildings too specific. If someone inside the department was feeding details to the arsonist, it would explain everything. Derek didn't waste any time. He called up Captain Ethan Cole, a trusted officer who had been with the department for years. Ethan had always been reliable, but now, Derek wasn't sure who to trust. "Ethan, we need to talk," Derek said as he called his colleague. He could hear the surprise in Ethan's voice. "What's going on?" Derek hesitated, knowing the risk of accusing someone without proof, but he had to follow his instincts. "I think there's something you need to know. Meet me at the station." Ethan agreed, and within the hour, he was sitting across from Derek, his face serious but calm. "You've got to stop this investigation, Derek," Ethan said bluntly, his eyes meeting Derek's. "It's not safe." Derek narrowed his gaze. "What do you mean? What do you know about the fires?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I told you to stay out of this. You're getting too close." Before Derek could respond, Roxy jumped up from her spot, her nose suddenly on alert. She moved toward Ethan, sniffing the air around him. Derek watched, his eyes narrowing. The way Roxy was reacting, it was more than just curiosity. There was something on Ethan's boots. "Roxy, stop," Derek ordered, but it was too late. The dog had already sniffed his way to Ethan's boots and was now growling, a low, warning sound that made the air around them tense. Derek leaned in, his eyes following Roxy's every move. The smell of chemicals, accelerants, was unmistakable. Roxy had picked up the scent, the same one they'd found at the warehouse. Ethan's face paled. "This is crazy. You can't do this, Derek." Without saying a word, Derek stood and walked to his desk, pulling out the files from the warehouse. As he spread the papers across the table, his eyes scanned for anything that could tie Ethan to the fires. His mind raced, but he knew this wasn't just a coincidence anymore. There had to be a connection, something that made sense of it all. Before Derek could say anything further, his phone rang again. He picked it up, his pulse quickening as he listened. Another fire had been set. Derek and Roxy raced through the city streets, the sirens wailing in the distance. They arrived too late to prevent the damage. The building was already engulfed in flames. As Derek stood outside, watching the fire consume another part of the city, he felt the weight of the situation press down on him. Derek stood there, watching the fire rage. The stakes had never been higher, and the connection between the arsonist and someone inside the fire department was undeniable. Roxy, ever the loyal partner, stayed close by his side, her presence a comforting constant in the chaos. But Derek could feel the walls closing in on him. The investigation had taken a dark turn. What had started as a series of seemingly unrelated fires had turned into something much worse, something deeply personal. The revelation that Ethan Cole might be involved was a shock, but it was clear now that there were deeper layers to the situation. The fires weren't just about destruction, they were about power, control, and revenge. The whispers among his colleagues were starting to grow louder. People who had once been open to helping Derek now avoided his questions, casting nervous glances his way. Captain Hayes had begun to back off, and even Morrison seemed less willing to speak openly. The more Derek pushed, the more defensive his coworkers became, as though they were hiding something. But what? Roxy's ears perked up suddenly, her head snapping toward Officer Richards, who had just entered the station. Derek watched her, noticing her tense posture. She wasn't just alert, she was on edge. "What's wrong, girl?" Derek muttered, crouching down next to Roxy, who was now growling low in her throat. The dog's eyes never left Richards, who, to Derek's knowledge, hadn't been involved in the investigation. But now, Roxy's reaction spoke volumes. Derek stood up slowly, his mind piecing together the puzzle. Richards had always been quiet, a bit of a loner, but Derek never thought much of it. Now, he couldn't help but wonder if Roxy had picked up on something that his human instincts had missed. Could Richards be another piece of the puzzle? Another compromised officer? As the day wore on, Derek's growing suspicion weighed heavily on him. It wasn't just Richards now. It was the whole department. Every lead he tried to follow seemed to twist back in on itself, leading him nowhere. Each time he dug deeper, the walls seemed to close tighter. He was alone in this, completely alone. No one was willing to help, no one was willing to listen. The tension was suffocating. His colleagues were closing ranks, and Derek's sense of isolation only deepened. But it wasn't just the department he was worried about anymore. His thoughts kept drifting to his family, the people closest to him, the ones who had always been there. What if the arsonist had started targeting them? It was one evening, as he was heading home from the station, that his fears were realized. His phone rang, and the voice on the other end made his blood run cold. "Derek, you need to get to your family's house. Now," the voice said, frantic. It was his brother, Matt. Derek's heart dropped into his stomach. "What happened?" "There's a fire," Matt said, his voice shaking. "Mom and Dad, they're inside. You need to get here, Derek." Derek's head spun, his thoughts clouded by panic. He knew it was the arsonist. It had to be. The attacks had now escalated to something far more personal. "Matt, stay out of the house." "Do you hear me?" Derek shouted into the phone. "Stay out. I'll be there in 5 minutes." He slammed his foot down on the accelerator and didn't look back. The sirens screamed through the night, but even their wail couldn't drown out the growing knot in Derek's chest. His family, his mother, his father, the people he'd sworn to protect, were at risk. And it was all because of the firebug, the same person who had caused so much destruction in the city. Derek could feel the weight of their safety pressing on his shoulders. By the time he arrived, the flames were licking at the sides of the house. The smoke billowed out of the windows, dark and thick. Derek rushed inside, fighting the heat and the choking smoke. He pushed through the haze, calling for his parents. His brother, Matt, was standing outside, shaking, unable to go back in. "They're inside," Matt yelled, but Derek couldn't hear him anymore. His focus was entirely on getting through the house. As Derek searched the house, he remembered something. A fire years ago that had torn through their old neighborhood. The fire that had killed his father. Derek hadn't been able to put all the pieces together back then, but now, with the recent events, it all clicked into place. The pattern, the targeted buildings, the precision of the arsonist, it mirrored the same patterns from the fire that had taken his father's life. In the midst of his search, Derek found a picture of his father, taken years ago. But there was something strange about it. His father was standing next to none other than Ethan Cole. Derek felt his heart sink as he stared at the photo. Ethan. The same man who had been acting so defensively. The same man who had tried to throw Derek off the scent. It wasn't just a coincidence. Ethan had been involved in both fires years ago, and now he had to be. "Roxy, find it," Derek whispered, his voice tight with urgency. Roxy was already on the move, her keen nose working quickly. She moved into the other room, and Derek followed. It wasn't long before Roxy stopped in front of Ethan's office, sniffing the doorframe. Derek pushed open the door, and Roxy immediately jumped onto Ethan's desk, pointing at a drawer. Inside the drawer, Derek found what he was looking for: documents, photos, and blueprints of city projects. And there, in the corner of the file, a photograph of the fire that had killed his father. It was all connected. Suddenly, the door to the office creaked open, and Derek turned. Ethan stood there, his face twisted in anger. "You should have stayed out of this, Derek," Ethan spat, his voice low and dangerous. "You never should have dug so deep." Derek stood firm. "Why, Ethan? Why all of this?" Ethan's expression darkened, and for a moment, Derek thought he might just walk away from the confrontation. But then, Ethan stepped forward, his eyes burning with years of hatred. "It's revenge," Ethan said coldly. "For my family. For the mistakes of your father. The city owes me. And now, I'm going to make sure they pay. You'll never stop me." Before Derek could respond, the room exploded with flames. The fire had spread quicker than they expected, and now, Derek had to make a choice: capture Ethan or save the people who were still trapped inside. Roxy lunged at Ethan, and the two of them fought through the smoke and flames, moving toward the exit. But as they reached the door, Derek hesitated. He could hear people yelling from the other rooms, screaming for help. Lives were at stake, and Derek had no choice but to act. With a final push, Derek pinned Ethan to the ground, the roar of the fire surrounding them. The weight of the decision pressed on him. He could bring Ethan to justice, but at what cost? As the fire department arrived, Derek and Roxy had made their choice. Ethan was arrested, his plan thwarted. But the emotional toll on Derek was just beginning. The investigation was over, the fires were finally extinguished, but the scars left behind would take longer to heal. As he watched Roxy, lying quietly by his side, Derek knew that the bond between them would remain unbroken. The case was closed. But the damage, the loss, the personal cost, it was something Derek would carry with him for the rest of his life.